In the blood-soaked history of the Roman Empire, few stories are as chilling and tragic as that of Sporus. This isn't just another tale about emperors and conquests. It's about the terrifying way power, when unchecked, can distort love into possession and twist grief into cruelty. At the center of this nightmare is a beautiful young boy who caught the eye of one of the most infamous emperors in history, Nero. We're in 65 AD. The Roman Empire is at its peak, stretching from the rainy isles of Britain to the edge of the Euphrates. And ruling over this vast machine of conquest and culture is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a man who's already built a reputation for excess, violence, and madness. Rome itself is still healing from the devastating fire of 64 AD, and whispers about the emperor's mental state drift through the city like smoke. Inside the golden palace of Nero, his sprawling Domus Aurea, another fire is smoldering, one that will soon engulf an innocent life. That life is Sporus, a young freedman living within the imperial household. Now technically a free man, yes, but in reality, he was just another figure caught in the web of the emperor's absolute power. Sporus wasn't ambitious. He wasn't a schemer. He didn't plot his way into the court. He was simply beautiful. Accounts from the time describe him as having an almost otherworldly appearance, delicate, graceful, and hauntingly feminine. And in ancient Rome, beauty wasn't always a blessing. In Sporus's case, it became his curse. The catalyst for what happened next: the death of Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was Nero's second wife, and by all accounts, the great obsession of his life. She died in 65 AD under murky circumstances. Some sources say Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her to death while she was pregnant. Others blame complications during childbirth. The truth may be lost to time, but what's clear is this: Nero was shattered, and his grief was not the quiet, mournful kind. It was wild, erratic, and dangerous. The emperor didn't want to move on. He wanted Poppaea back. And into that grief-stricken madness stepped Sporus, by accident, by fate, or maybe by the design of someone in the palace. When Nero saw the boy, he was stunned. The resemblance to his late wife, historians tell us, was uncanny. And for a man as unstable as Nero, that resemblance was all he needed to act. In the twisted logic of imperial Rome, where emperors had the power of gods and the morality of spoiled children, what happened next was horrifying, but not surprising. Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated. It was a brutal decision. It wasn't just physical mutilation. It was the erasure of Sporus's identity. He would no longer be a boy, nor a man. He would become something else entirely, a living replacement for a dead empress. The procedure would have been done quietly, in the hidden rooms of the palace, where marble walls swallowed screams and servants knew better than to ask questions. Sporus's body was changed, forever. But the worst part was still to come. Nero, having remade Sporus in his image of Poppaea, announced he was going to marry him. A full public ceremony. With all the fanfare and extravagance of a real imperial wedding. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, Poppaea's name. He was dressed in imperial women's clothing, adorned with Poppaea's own jewelry, and introduced to the court as the new empress of Rome. Everyone, from senators to slaves, was expected to go along with it, to pretend this wasn't horrifying, to bow and call him lady. And so in front of Rome's elite, Nero staged a wedding. He wore the robes of a groom. Sporus, barely a teenager, freshly mutilated, traumatized, was paraded through the ceremony as his bride. The empire watched, stunned and silent, as this macabre theater unfolded. It was a marriage in name only, a mockery of every tradition and every human boundary. But it didn't stop there. After the wedding, Sporus wasn't hidden away. He was paraded through Rome, attending public ceremonies and official events dressed in full imperial regalia. He was expected to smile, wave, perform. He was now part of Nero's court, not as himself, but as someone else. Someone dead. Can you imagine the weight of that? Being forced to live as the ghost of a woman who might have been murdered by the same man now claiming to love you. Every public appearance, every dinner, every procession was another reminder that Sporus wasn't seen as a person anymore. He was an object, a symbol, a tool of Nero's grief and delusion. The Roman people, familiar as they were with strange behavior from their rulers, were disturbed. Even in an age of decadence and violence, this crossed a line. They saw a boy dressed as a woman, moving like an empress, but carrying the faint signs of who he really was. The surgeries couldn't fully hide it, and those who looked closely enough could see the truth, see the pain. Nero, for his part, seemed completely consumed. He acted as if Sporus really was Poppaea returned from the grave. He called him by her name. He spoke to him as if nothing had changed. He demanded that Sporus speak, dress, walk, and behave like the dead empress. There was no room for Sporus's real identity. That had been carved away. It wasn't just physical. This was psychological torture. A never-ending role in a play Sporus never auditioned for. And the show traveled. Nero took Sporus with him on official tours of Greece, showing him off to foreign rulers and nobles. Imagine being forced to play a character every moment of every day in front of strangers, never allowed to slip, never allowed to say, "I am not who you think I am." By this point, Sporus wasn't just trapped in the palace. He was trapped inside himself. And yet, the confusion didn't stop Nero from showering him with gifts, affection, praise. The emperor would bounce between violent rage and performative tenderness, creating a cycle of manipulation that's textbook abuse. If Sporus failed to meet his expectations, even slightly, Nero would lash out. But then, in the next breath, he might embrace him, offer a new gift, whisper something sweet. It was maddening. Meanwhile, the people around them, the courtiers, the staff, the guards, they all played along. They had no choice. Address Sporus as Empress. Bow, curtsy, pretend. Even if they pitied him, even if they were disgusted, they kept the illusion alive. Because to break it, that was dangerous. Sporus, for his part, had to live this lie constantly, wearing women's clothing. Speaking in the soft, measured tones of Roman noblewomen, adopting the gestures, the mannerisms, the posture of an empress, and behind it all, the physical reminders, the scars, the pain, never let him forget what had been done. And still, there was no escape. As time wore on, cracks started to show. Sporus became more withdrawn, more subdued. The constant pressure to perform, to be someone he wasn't, began to wear him down, but he couldn't stop. To drop the act meant punishment, or worse. And all the while, Nero's grip on power was weakening. After Nero's death, the empire plunged into a period of intense instability, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. A chaotic chapter where 4 different men claimed the throne in quick succession. Sporus, now stripped of even the frail protection Nero had offered, became a vulnerable pawn in a dangerous political game. He was passed like spoils of war from one powerful man to another, his body and identity still tethered to the memory of an emperor most of Rome had come to hate. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian Guard prefect who had once supported Nero, but quickly turned on him when the tides shifted. Nymphidius fancied himself the next emperor, and, in a twisted echo of Nero's own behavior, sought to legitimize his power by taking Sporus as his wife. Historical accounts suggest that Nymphidius even referred to Sporus as Sabina, just as Nero had, and paraded him in public to reinforce his own connection to imperial legacy. But Nymphidius's reign was short-lived. The Praetorians, realizing they had backed the wrong man, turned on him and killed him before his rule could solidify. Sporus once again found himself at the mercy of fate, shuffled into the court of Otho, one of the next short-lived emperors. Though the details of his treatment under Otho are less well recorded, what's clear is that Sporus remained a political and symbolic tool, not a person. At this point, Sporus was likely no longer a teenager. Years of trauma, emotional, physical, and psychological, had shaped him into a figure of tragic notoriety. Though accounts vary on his age, he was probably in his early 20s, yet had lived a lifetime's worth of suffering. Wherever he went, his presence stirred whispers. He was a reminder of Nero's depravity, a ghost of a failed empire, and a living symbol of power's grotesque capacity to destroy. It was during the reign of Vitellius, the third emperor of that violent year, that Sporus's story took its final and most humiliating turn. Vitellius, known for his cruelty and appetite for spectacle, reportedly planned to force Sporus into yet another public performance. This time, however, it would not be a wedding. According to Cassius Dio, Vitellius wanted to reenact the rape of Proserpina, an ancient myth in which the god Pluto abducts the maiden Proserpina and drags her to the underworld. Sporus would be cast in the role of the maiden, dressed once again in feminine garments, but this time not as an empress. The reenactment was rumored to include elements of theatrical violence and public humiliation. It would have been a grotesque spectacle. A once revered imperial figure paraded before the masses as the subject of a cruel mythological parody. For Sporus, this was a line he could not cross. Whatever shred of dignity remained, he clung to it. Facing the prospect of another public violation, one that would reduce him to an object of mockery and pain, he made a final, desperate choice. He took his own life. Exactly how he died is lost to history. Some sources suggest he may have opened his veins, the same method of suicide favored by many Roman nobles. Others hint at poison or another method. What matters more than the method, though, is the motivation. Sporus chose death rather than endure one more moment of being something he was not, something he never asked to be. In a world that had stripped him of autonomy, identity, and even his name, this final act was perhaps the only choice he ever truly made for himself. What's left to us now is the echo of a life turned into theater. A boy robbed of his body and name, made to impersonate a woman, then weaponized as a political statement, and ultimately destroyed. Sporus never sought power. He never raised a sword or penned a law. He never chose the roles forced upon him by Nero and his successors. Yet his story endures precisely because it speaks to something timeless and terrifying. The ability of power to warp not just laws and cities, but the very essence of another human being. Some might try to paint Sporus as merely a footnote in Nero's reign or a bizarre anecdote in the decline of the Roman Empire. But when you pull back and really look at the tragedy, it becomes clear that Sporus is not just a footnote. He's a central figure in a much darker narrative. He is the embodiment of how empires can consume people whole, how love, twisted by power, can become indistinguishable from cruelty, how identity, when dictated from above, becomes a prison instead of a truth. His story raises unsettling questions that echo far beyond the marble ruins of Rome. What does it mean to lose yourself so thoroughly that even your name becomes someone else's fantasy? What happens when the performance never ends, and the mask you wear becomes the only face the world lets you have? These are not just historical curiosities. They are questions about power, identity, trauma, and ultimately, the struggle to reclaim some part of yourself in a world that insists you play a role. The ancient world left us many lessons, but few are as harrowing and as haunting as the story of Sporus. When we talk about Nero, we often talk about the Great Fire, the murders, the debauchery, the fiddle while Rome burned. But maybe the most damning evidence of his madness is not in the buildings he burned or the rivals he killed, but in the life he tried to recreate. The life of his wife, through the body and soul of a young boy who never stood a chance. And in the end, what remains of Sporus? Not statues, not temples, not even a tomb we can point to. What remains is a name, borrowed, twisted, erased, and a story that still refuses to die. Sporus' story, tragic and surreal as it is, lingers not just because of its horror, but because of what it reveals about the nature of power in ancient Rome, and perhaps the nature of power everywhere. Rome was a civilization obsessed with control. Control over land, over people, over history itself. Emperors didn't just want to rule, they wanted to shape reality. And Nero, in his desperation to bring back someone he had lost, found in Sporus a living canvas for that delusion. But this wasn't just Nero's madness. It was enabled, preserved, and even applauded by a system built on hierarchy, spectacle, and silence. Think about the layers of complicity. Physicians who performed the castration, courtiers who addressed Sporus as empress, senators who looked the other way, audiences who watched the pageantry unfold in silent discomfort. Sporus may have been victimized by a single emperor, but he was dehumanized by an entire empire, an empire that treated his identity as theater, his pain as a backdrop. There's something deeply modern about that. We may like to think we've moved past such cruelty, but even today, people are often forced into roles they didn't choose. They're told who they are. They're denied agency over their own bodies and stories. Sporus' life, in many ways, is not just an ancient tragedy. It's a mirror held up to power itself. And yet, there's another side to his legacy. Because even though Sporus didn't leave behind writings or monuments, his story survived. He was not forgotten. Roman historians wrote about him. Later scholars debated his identity. And now, centuries later, we still speak his name. Not Nero's wife, not Sabina, but Sporus. His name, his story. That survival in itself is a kind of resistance. It also challenges us to think differently about how we remember the past. History often revolves around emperors, generals, and wars. But sometimes, the most illuminating stories are those of the people caught in the margins. People like Sporus, whose lives were warped by the ambitions of others, but whose suffering reveals the true cost of unchecked power. In that sense, Sporus isn't just a figure from the past. He's a symbol of something ongoing. A reminder that real lives are lived behind the pageantry of history, and that even the most extravagant empires are built on the backs of the voiceless. It's also worth noting that even in the ancient world, some recognized the cruelty of what had been done to Sporus. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, despite their own biases, didn't frame the marriage as a love story. They described it as disturbing, grotesque, unnatural, not because of Sporus' gender presentation, but because of the obvious abuse and coercion involved. That's a significant distinction. It means that even in an age of brutality, people saw the humanity behind the mask. They saw Sporus not just as Nero's bride, but as a person consumed by a powerful man's obsession. Today, historians still debate the specifics. Was Sporus truly a freedman or a slave? Did he have any say at all in his fate? Was there ever a moment of real affection between him and Nero? These questions may never be fully answered, but what we do know is that his story resonates far beyond the ruins of the Roman Forum. It's a story of identity stolen, of trauma endured, and of the quiet, invisible cost of empire. In recent years, some scholars and artists have tried to reclaim Sporus, not just as a victim, but as a figure of tragic resilience. He's been reimagined in novels, plays, even operas, as a symbol of what it means to survive impossible circumstances. Some view him as an early figure in queer history, though that label, like any modern identity, can't be perfectly mapped onto an ancient life. Still, that urge to see Sporus, to really see him, rather than just view him as Nero's puppet, is powerful. It reminds us that every historical figure we reduce to a symbol or anecdote had a heartbeat, a mind, and fears of their own. It's easy to write off Sporus as a cautionary tale about one emperor's madness, but it's more honest and more unsettling to see his life as a window into how entire systems can distort the most basic human experiences. Love, grief, identity, and selfhood. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur and power, could not give Sporus dignity. It could not grant him peace. But maybe we can, if only by remembering him as more than a footnote. He was not an empress. He was not a spectacle. He was a boy. He was a human being. And his story deserves to be told, not because it flatters the powerful, but because it exposes them. That's the strange power of history. It can turn emperors into shadows, and it can bring light to those who were once forced to live in silence. So the next time we marvel at the Colosseum, or quote Marcus Aurelius, or debate the rise and fall of great empires, remember Sporus. Remember the cost behind the stone. Remember the boy who was dressed as a queen, mutilated for love, paraded for power, and ultimately chose death over another performance. Because in the end, it's not Nero's madness that haunts us. It's Sporus's silence. And that silence still speaks.